Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I'm very happy to welcome you to this 10th and last session of the high-level Transatlantic lecture series that the America-Europe Fund and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven have launched during the spring of 2021. In today's lecture, we focus on Russia, divergence and convergence in transatlantic cooperation under the new Biden administration. My name is Jean-Arthur Gibault. I'm currently the ambassador for the Kingdom of Belgium in the United States and former Belgian ambassador to the Russian Federation. I'm very honored to have been asked to moderate today's lecture. Please allow me first to say something about the America-Europe Fund at Catholic University Leuven. The aim of the fund is to contribute to a better comparative knowledge and understanding of the United States and the European Union, and to stronger mutual relations. This obviously includes Belgium as the host of both the European institutions and NATO, which President Biden just visited last week. Belgium also has a long-standing tradition in hosting American business headquarters in Europe. To this end, the fund promotes academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research at KU Leuven aimed at strengthening comparative knowledge of American and European societies. The fund also initiates cooperation and exchanges between the US, the EU, Belgium, and its regions in the fields of education, science, business, culture, diplomacy, and policy making. Now briefly about today's lecture. Transatlantic conversation is topically placed in the immediate aftermath of the many summits that took place last week. NATO summit, EUUS summit in Brussels, and US-Russia summit in Geneva. Relations between Western democracies and Russia are challenging, but not without perspective. There is a continued need for collaboration with Russia on global issues like arms control, non-proliferation, climate change, fighting terrorism. But over the years, Russia and the West have become increasingly estranged from each other. They have diverging interpretations of international law, democracy, human rights, security principles. Russia's discontent with the European security order, its authoritarian turn, and determination to sow division and discontent among Western societies are unlikely to disappear in the near future. Hence, it is vital for the US and the EU to develop a common approach vis-à-vis Russia based on their current assessment of strategic goals, interests, and values, and on the need to continue dialogue on certain issues. What are the key takeaways from each side of the summit of last week? How can the US and the EU work more effectively together on Russia, increase convergence, and limit divergence in transatlantic cooperation? These and other issues will be addressed in today's closing transatlantic lecture. I am happy to introduce the two distinguished speakers for today, as always, an American and a European speaker. First, Mrs. Heather Conley of the Washington-based think tank CSIS, and on the other side, Professor Lien Verpoest of KU Leuven. Heather Conley is Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic, and Director of the Europe Program at CSIS, one of the major think tanks in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining this think tank in 2009, she served 4 years at the American National Red Cross. And from 2001 to 2005, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, with responsibilities for US bilateral relations with the countries of Northern and Central Europe. Welcome, Heather. Professor Lien Verpoest is Associate Professor at the History Department of the Catholic University Leuven Faculty of Arts and Academic Director of the Center for Russian Studies. Her research lies at the intersection of history, area studies, and comparative politics. She works from a contemporary as well as an historical perspective. Research focused on diplomatic history and East-West relations, and on the relations between various regional and sub-regional networks and organizations on the Eurasian continent. So, as always, as a moderator, I warmly invite the audience to ask questions in the Q&A box, which is marked by a question mark on your screen. So you can always raise questions by writing them into this box during the lecture. Do not hesitate, and I will read them later on during the conversation. I now give the floor to the first of our speakers tonight, Heather, who will present the American perspective. So Heather, please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Gibault. It's such a pleasure to be here. My many thanks to the Leuven Center for this kind invitation. What a timely discussion topic. I feel like we've just barely finished with analyzing the US-Russian summit in Geneva. So let me just give you some reflections from that summit, and then most importantly, how do we move ahead transatlantically regarding Russia? I think as we built ourselves up to the US-Russia summit, it was clear that there was agreement between Moscow and Washington on, number one, that the relationship between the United States and Russia had really reached an all-time low point since the Cold War. So both sides agreed that the relationship was in a state of crisis. The other thing that both sides agreed on was they had very low expectations for what that summit was going to produce. But clearly it was very important for President Biden to meet with President Putin face to face. I think it's very clear President Biden is what we call a retail politician, meaning he likes to shake hands, he likes to look at people face to face to deliver the messages that he must deliver. So that was sort of, tensions are high in the relationship, expectations were low. So this produced a lot of questions actually in the United States of why President Biden was affording President Putin so much attention and platform. Obviously, the historic backdrop of Geneva, which harkened back to Cold War summits of 1985, of the Reagan-Gorbachev summit, it was giving Mr. Putin an enormous platform. There was some criticism of that, particularly as it was unclear what exactly the summit would achieve. But in many ways, this was part of the White House's new policy approach to Russia. I call it the gamble or the bargain. The bargain being that President Biden would give Mr. Putin a great deal of respect. He would not be emotional or speak disparagingly of Mr. Putin. Of course, that's what in some ways prompted this summit in the beginning, with President Biden agreeing with a journalist that President Putin was a killer. That led to Ambassador Antonov, the Russian ambassador here in Washington, to be recalled, which propelled the United States to recall its ambassador, John Sullivan, back home. So in some ways, leaving that emotion out, but giving Mr. Putin respect, treating the Russian government with respect, but in return, it would be for Mr. Putin and the Russian government to respect international legal norms. So that's the bargain. We will not say you're a regional power. We will treat you as a great power. Mr. Biden said a worthy adversary. And he called Mr. Putin tough and bright. Again, coming very far away from the language that was used earlier. But the return request was Mr. Putin follow rules and norms, particularly in cyber. And that was where Mr. Biden laid some clear markers down on cyber attacks on 16 critical infrastructure areas. He also laid down some very clear lines on human rights. And this, of course, is about Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. There would be devastating consequences should Mr. Navalny die in prison. So that was sort of the attempt to sort of reframe the US-Russian relationship in the White House's view. But the gamble is, will Russia respond? And will they respect international norms? of which we have a pattern, at least over the last decade, of repeated violations of international law, whether that's the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, to the Chemical Weapons Convention, the use of military-grade poisoning of Russian opposition figures, or even in Syria, or violations of arms control treaties like the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So that's really the grand bargain. We don't know whether that bargain will work out or not. We really do have to watch Russia's behavior. Will it change, or will we continue to see similar patterns? I have to say, we haven't gotten off to too auspicious of a beginning. Certainly, we are trying to follow very closely the Polish government's recent announcement of their cyber attacks with attribution towards Russia. Just yesterday, Bard College, a very important university in the United States, which has had a long-standing academic exchange program in St. Petersburg, was just declared an undesirable organization, ending that valuable dialogue that we really hope that will sustain this relationship even as it experiences tensions. We are preparing for the Zapad, the major annual military exercise that Russia conducts with Belarus along its western military district. We'll have to see whether that is provocative or not in its manifestations. But I will say what gives me the greatest hope, and I'll turn this back over to you, Ambassador Hijibo, that what the President Biden's trip to Europe established in its sequence is that it was so important to consult with allies first. As you mentioned, first the NATO summit, making sure that NATO has a strong collective deterrence and defense posture towards future Russian aggression. That sign of strength is absolutely critical as we work towards dialogue with Russia. We need that unity and that strength at NATO, and we'll need to continue that, certainly as we see Russia's military buildup along its western military district. The second, of course, is the US-EU relationship, the creation of this high-level dialogue on Russia. We've already seen benefits of the Biden administration working closely with the European Union on sanctions related to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, on sanctioning of Belarus for its air piracy and human rights violations. That sign of strength and unity is so important. That allows us to proceed, I think, with a more productive dialogue with Russia. If we were not unified, if we weren't showing strength, it would make dialogue very, very difficult and continue to encourage Russia to probe our weaknesses internally, but also probe really where those red lines are. And I have no doubt that those red lines will be tested, but if we are unified, if we have strength in our response, again, I think we now have the conditions for a more positive engagement with Russia, and we have much work to do, particularly on arms control. So I think it was a successful trip. It was a gamble, and we'll just have to see if that gamble pays off. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your introduction, Heather, and I'll give the floor to Lien in Leuven, please, from the European perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and hello everyone, and thank you, Heather, for your very interesting insights. I am Lien from Leuven, indeed, and I will show you some slides. I prepared a bit of an overview just to give you the European perspective, but also to show you where we are now. And also, as I'm not a policymaker, but an academic, I would try to give you some academic insights from me and my colleagues who have been studying EU-Russia relations over the past 20 years, let's say, and so to show you what these insights can maybe also bring to the discussion. So I will share my screen. I would like to tell you a bit about Russia and the EU through two perspectives. First of all, the key developments of the past years, and then also the academic insights that I mentioned. And I would like to start with the 16th of June last week, As Heather already said, that there were quite some meetings, but also on the European level, Josep Borrell, the High Representative, presented a report titled Push Back, Constrain and Engage, in which he detailed his relations or his view on future relations between the European Union and Russia. This report immediately elicited criticism from EU ambassadors. The political magazine quoted anonymously some remarks of EU ambassadors who said that it was not an operational report, that the conclusions were too general, etc. And immediately also this was partly acknowledged, and a more concrete list of proposals of how the EU should engage with Russia would normally follow in autumn. Just to give you a very quick overview of where Russia's relations with, where the EU's relations with Russia are right now, there are, of course, since 2014, economic sanctions in place against all the different sectors of the Russian economy. You can see it here. They are renewed every 6 months, and they're now to be renewed in July, and they're based, the renewal of these sanctions are based on the assessment of the implementation of the important Minsk agreements. So these sanctions, of course, were initiated during the Ukraine crisis in 2014. At the same time, there's also sanctions against individuals and entities. 177 people are on this sanction list of the European Union vis-à-vis Russia, and 48 entities, for example, entities responsible for undermining territorial integrity, so Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk People's Republic, etc. What are these sanctions? These are, as you can see on the left-hand side, an asset freeze and travel restrictions. Also, these sanctions are renewed every 6 months. Then there's also very much focus on Crimea and Sevastopol. There are also every 12 months, sanctions are renewed on business restrictions, and also even import-export ban and a ban on tourism towards Crimea and Sevastopol. This is maybe not as important as the diplomatic measures, and then the restriction on economic cooperation, which is also still in place and was initiated in 2014. So already for 7 years now, the usual, there used to be biannual EU-Russia summits. The first picture of my slides showed one of these summits in Yekaterinburg. It's a long time ago. These have been suspended, and also Russia, of course, is not no longer invited to G8 meetings. And then the restrictions on economic cooperation mainly entail that there is no lending to Russia from the EIB and the EBRD. These are infographics made by or available on the EU website, just to give you an overview. Another more recent type of sanctions that the EU has imposed date from March 2021, so very recently, and these are the global human rights sanctions, also often dubbed the European Magnitsky Act. So here we are with our convergence possibilities. This regime was established at the end of last year, and so the first sanctions that have been imposed by the EU in the framework of this global human rights regime are against 4 Russian individuals. I quote here the press release that went along with it. Individuals who contributed to arbitrary arrests and detentions, repression of freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of opinion and expression. And these are 4 people put on a sanction list because they played a role in the arrest, prosecution and sentencing of Alexei Navalny. So it's completely linked to the person of Alexei Navalny. And also here, the measures are a travel ban and asset freeze. So this is where we are concerning facts and sanctions. My apologies for the Russian language graph, but I will translate. I think it's also interesting to see the perspective of the Russian audience, the wider Russian audience towards, on the one hand, US, on the other hand, the European Union. So that's why I copy-pasted an info graph of Vizium, which is one of the main polling organizations in Russia, who check every every 6 months, I think, a group of respondents and their relation or their opinion towards relations with the US, with China, with the EU. And here you see the graph of the relations towards the United States. The blue line is the relations are bad, and the black line are the relations are good. And you can see the enormous drop in opinion on good relations, which is about around 2014. You can also see that the relations have gradually improved, but are not at all at the level anymore that they were before 2014. And the same for the EU. This is a similar graph. Also, the latest poll was in May 2021, and also here you can see that the big drop in opinion on good relations takes place in early 2014. Gradually, again here, the black line is good relations, the blue line is bad relations. It has been increasing again, has been restored, but not at all to the level it was before 2014. So just, I think as an information from the Russian side, it's interesting to see. And then some more facts before I move on to the academic insights. What was interesting in the report published last week and presented by the High Representative is that apart from the whole push back, constrain, engage discourse, it was also stressed, or there was also a paragraph stressing the strong economic relations of EU and Russia. And here you can, of course, see, they stress mainly that the EU is by far Russia's biggest trade partner, and also is by far the largest investor in Russia. So the fact that it is also added in this very critical report shows that there is, I wouldn't say two levels, but there is, it's rather ambiguous message that sometimes is being given by the EU on the relations with Russia. And so this is something that also has been pinpointed by quite some of my colleague academics studying relations between EU and Russia. I will get back to that. One more word about the report itself. It's a 15-page report. I read it with great interest. And if you read it, it mainly gives the impression of being a reiteration of what was said in 2016. The EU Council's 5 guiding principles for EU's relations with Russia are being repeated and further developed, let's say. So it's not this new report is not at all a change in opinion, but it kind of reinforces this view that the EU should be guided by these 5 principles that you can read here in its engagement with Russia. Stressing the implementation of the Minsk agreement, strengthening relations with Eastern partners, strengthening resilience, especially also on hybrid threats and strategic communication, selectively engaging with Russia, so kind of compartmentalization, and then also the need to engage in people-to-people contacts and support Russian civil society, which becomes, let's say, almost more difficult day by day. So these are, let's say, the facts, the sanctions that are in place, the opinion of the Russian audience, but also the report that has been issued last week. Now, if we take a step back, and this is, of course, what we like to do at university, and look at EU-Russia relations a bit more from a distance, there's 3 more things I would like to discuss with you. First of all, I would like to look at 4 important critical junctures in the relation between Russia and the EU, and the research insights that have originated, let's say, or have followed from these critical junctures. Secondly, two very important topics which have gained importance over the last 5-6 years. I would like to introduce to you, and then also I would like to end by talking a bit about EU and US actorness towards Russia. So if you bear with me, I will continue. First of all, critical junctures. This is a timeline. There's of course many critical junctures or many important moments in the relation between Russia and the European Union, but I've selected these 4 because they have led to very interesting insights, I think. The first one, I will discuss them in separate slides, but you can see 2004. There's of course the enlargement. One of the main insights was that this ended Russia's rhetoric Europeanization that maybe was present in the 90s. 2008, Eastern Partnership, of course, also the war between Russia and Georgia, but especially Eastern Partnership initiated higher level of regional competition between EU and Russia. Then 2012, the re-election of Putin, but also the protests on the Bolotnaya Square in Moscow led to the insight that civilizational nationalism in Russia was gaining ground in 2012. And then, of course, 2014, Euromaidan and Crimea has led to the insight of geopolitical othering. What do I mean by this? Let me elaborate briefly on these 4 critical junctures. In 2004, there was EU enlargement. This enlargement has, of course, had its effect in the eastern region of the European Union. And this effect was that the different neighboring countries, let's say, reacted very differently to the enlargement. One of my Ukrainian American colleagues, Taras Kudzio, pinpointed this as being geopolitical pluralism. He said already in 2004, there are very diverse ambitions between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus in its relations with the European Union. And Russia took the approach from then onwards towards the European Union of what one calls in Russian взаимовыгодный pragmatism, which means mutually advantageous pragmatism. If we engage in relations with the European Union from now on, it should always be in our national interest. And this was, at that moment, was something new for us. In 2008, there's a war with Georgia, but there is also the Eastern Partnership that was initiated. And there you can see there was different academics, Tom Kazir, for example, but also Michael Emerson in Brussels, started talking of possible clashes. There will be a clash of integration processes between EU and Russia. There will be a clash of paradigms. And of course, because the EU partnership was launched and also Eurasian integration kind of gained ground again, was restarted in 2000 and resulted in the Eurasian Economic Union in 2014. You could see the regional competition in the region between the EU and Russia growing stronger. And very often, it's very easy, of course, looking back and saying, where did we go wrong? But very often it is being said, for example, by Hannes Adomait, that at that moment, one could already see that there would be, at some moment, a clash. But the possibility of a geopolitical rift was still obscured by the fact that the economic relations between Russia and the EU at that moment, in 2008, were still improving and gaining ground. Third critical juncture I want to discuss with you is the 2012, the re-election of Putin and the protests, and the fact that there was a new layer added to relations. And this is something that was identified very strongly by a colleague of mine who works in Brussels, Tom Kazir, who wrote an article and very clearly said, from now on, you can see that the EU is a normative actor and Russia behaves like an interest-based actor. And this is one of the reasons behind the clash. A new concept also emerged. Emil Pine and Alexander Verkhovsky, two Russian academics, called it civilizational nationalism in Russia. Marlène Laruelle called it the Russian world discourse. This is something that I think we, at that moment, insufficiently acknowledged. The fact that in Russia itself, there was from then onwards, from 2012 onwards, an increased attention for traditional values, an open conservatism, as Putin proclaimed in his 2013 State of the Nation. And this contributed to a normative polarization between East and West. Then in 2014, there is the last important critical juncture. And this I would label geopolitical othering. So what do I mean by this? 2014, Crimea annexation, the result is sanctions. I just showed you the reach of these sanctions. The structural dialogue, the diplomatic dialogue was temporarily frozen. So the formal dialogue kind of came to a stop. On the informal level, at the same time, so, and by informal level, I mean the press, for example, the Russian media, but also Russian Duma members, you can see that an ever more explicit Russian norms and values paradigm emerged. And me and the PhD student, we are part of a project here at the University of Leuven, which is called Connectivity, Contestation, Cooperation in Global Governance. And we study Russian contestation of the West. And we published an article in which we study the fact that Russia, from 2014 onwards, very openly starts depicting the EU as the geopolitical and normative other. I will give you one example and then move on to my conclusion, because I've been speaking for 18 minutes, I can see. One example is LGBTQ rights. This is something we've studied in the framework in Ukraine and in Russia in the framework of a project on crisis diplomacy and the EU's role in it. And so what we noticed from analyzing mainly Russian and Ukrainian media is that especially in Russian media, and especially since 2014, the focus on homosexuality as being identified as something foreign increased enormously. I put some examples. I think some of you might know the discourse that has been present in Russia, calling Europe Gayropa, calling Euromaidan Gayromaidan. There was also, for example, a Russia Duma member who proposed to ban homosexuality in public, so to go one step further than the law on gay propaganda, really banning homosexuality. And he defended his opinion by saying this is Russia, not the West. And so this geopolitical othering, what is it? It is stressing the foreignness of homosexuality, saying this is something very typical for the West and more in specific Europe. You can see the picture there. This is actually a billboard which was put up in the run-up to Euromaidan. So when Ukraine was about to sign an association agreement with the EU, Viktor Medvedchuk, who is a proponent of Putin, active politically in Ukraine, his party, Ukrainian Choice, put up these billboards all over Ukraine, saying an association with the European Union will mean the acceptance of same-sex marriages in Ukraine. So this is what I mean by this geopolitical othering, associating the West and more specifically Europe with ideas, values, morals, which are very strange to one's own society. This is another example where you can see that in 2014, in full crisis between the European Union and Russia, because of Ukraine, the Human Rights Commissioner of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a report on the human rights situation in the European Union, in which he also heckles the EU's aggressive promotion of sexual minorities' rights and the attempts to enforce on other countries an alien view of homosexuality and same-sex marriages as a norm of life and a natural social phenomenon. So just to say, this is one example of this othering. To conclude my intervention, I want to say one more word on the EU, US, Russia triangle, let's say. It's interesting to see that, for example, some Norwegian colleagues made an analysis of the positions of the EU and the US vis-à-vis Russia, and actually also China, but I omitted it from the slides because we're talking about Russia today. And they identified, they said, okay, there's two tracks that the EU and Russia can follow, the EU and US can follow in engaging with Russia. On the one hand, they can join forces and they can coordinate and they can go for convergence. On the other hand, the EU can develop its own policies. And so they studied the case of how the EU and US dealt with the Ukraine crisis. They studied this case to look how there was, or whether there was convergence, whether these the EU and the US joined forces. And there you can see that there were a lot of efforts towards coordination, but there was no very coordinated or completely coordinated balancing act. And of course, you also remember Victoria Nuland at a certain moment expressed a lot of irritation and frustration about the EU and how they handled the Ukraine crisis. But still, before the Ukraine crisis, there was much, the EU-US dimension, let's say, in its relations with Russia was much less present than after. So I think I join Heather in saying that I think at this moment we're in the best possible position or to engage and to coordinate a common position between the EU and the United States towards Russia. So to conclude my presentation, or what I want to say, the facts, the sanctions are in place. They will be made more concrete, or the report will be made more concrete in the autumn of this year. I think, and this already also has been mentioned by both Ambassador Regibaud and Mrs. Conley, the main challenge for the EU is the diverging interests of the EU member states. How can we be critical of Russia's gay propaganda law if we also have one in Hungary, for example? And I think what we shouldn't underestimate, and this is, of course, to take into account the Russian perspective, is the success of this discourse of civilizational nationalism and of Russian civilization, enormous attention for Russian history, traditions, and this in connection also, or hand in hand with the geopolitical othering of Europe. This is a pitfall that we should be very attentive of. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Lynn, for what was both history, but also an insightful analysis. Heather, may I turn to you to ask if you have any reaction about this reading of recent history and the current situation?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. That was a really comprehensive overview. I think I quite frankly am surprised at the level of tensions between between Russia and the European Union. I think in part this is because of Russia's behavior, and the cumulative effect of it has actually forced a much tougher positioning by the European Union. I remember when EU sanctions were first placed against Russia because of the annexation of Crimea and incursions into Donbass, we weren't sure if after every 6 months they would roll over. We thought EU member states that had strong economic and political and historical ties to Russia would somehow prevent that, but they remained. I mean, many reasons why they did. They were some were grandfathered. There were lots of space that was given, but it's been fairly tough. And what I've been surprised most recently is typically Russia would try to keep the EU close to it and divide the United States from its allies. That was always a very traditional role that it played. But now it's in a real self-isolating posture, meaning it is pushing the EU away in addition to the US. And I think this self-isolating posture, we really need to understand. I think it is in part for regime preservation and survival, to keep that Western contamination away from it. We can talk about that a little bit more. It's to create those buffer zones. So Belarus is now a major buffer zone between the West and Russia. But you know, as the economics point out, Russia is pushing away, in many ways, its most important market. As sanctions continue to increase, Russia is going to feel those Belarusian sanctions as well. So there's sort of a follow-on effect there. But yet we still do see the divisions within the EU. And of course, a topic of great conversation here in Washington is Nord Stream 2. So you still don't have unity of purpose when it comes to Russia from the European Union. We've seen when Josep Borrell went to Moscow several months ago, the treatment that Sergei Lavrov gave him for lack of preparation on what that, it's great to have dialogue, but that dialogue has to have purpose. You have to have the clarity and unity of policy, and then you speak with Russia. Again, this is why President Biden went to Brussels first before he went to Geneva. We have to have that unity. And while I think there is greater resolve today, we know there is great penetration of the EU economically, politically, and that will weaken the EU's resolve. Of course, that's not just for Russia itself. The Chinese influence works in very similar patterns, economic and political dimensions, which is why, again, President Biden's whole framing of the international system right now is one of democracies getting healthy themselves, economically and politically, to better manage increased confrontation with authoritarian regimes such as China, such as Russia. We don't wish to be here. This is not what policy was designed 25 years ago. We wanted to successfully integrate Russia and China into the international economic structures and governance structures. Unfortunately, we're just in a different place, and we have to prepare ourselves for a different outcome.
Thank you. So I remind the audience that you can raise questions with both our speakers by using the question mark on the screen. Lynn, I turn to you. I understand from what Heather just said that actually Russia itself is pushing both the US and the EU more or less in the same definition and the same box, and strengthening itself no longer just from the US, but also from the EU. So do you see it as an opportunity indeed for the Americans and the Europeans to act closer together when it comes to defining a policy vis-a-vis Russia?
I do. I think it's, well, I think it's mainly important to keep the communication lines open, as President Biden now did by first passing through Brussels. I think this is really it was a very exemplary or a very good way of looking at it. At the same time, it's remarkable, and I think you've identified this very correctly, Heather. That's it's, I wouldn't say for the first time, of course, because we all know the 20th century, but how Russia, who engaged for a long time with Europe, who also has such a strong common history with Europe, and there always have been good, from the 18th century onwards, there have been good and bad moments in this relationship. But Europe has for a very long time been, especially also culturally, but also civilizationally, has been a touchstone for Russia. And now, and this is why I talked about this civilizational nationalism, it's almost not a complete rejection, but a rejection of certain parts of European culture, politics, policies. And so 2014, I think, has been a very defining moment for Russia, of course, also for Ukraine. Because of course, a country like Ukraine, for example, has been balancing for decades between Europe and Russia, and at that moment made a very decisive choice against Russia, not only for Europe, but very much against Russia. And I think that this is also something that was, apart from economic aspects and security aspects, that was such a shock to even to the common Russian audience, the broader audience, and even the Ukrainian audience. I think I have some Ukrainian friends who at that moment, whose native language was Russian, but started speaking Ukrainian just because of out of principle. And these are just small examples, but just to illustrate how deep this juncture of 2014 has been. And so for Europe, for the European Union side, I think what we see, the sanctions that are now in place, it took a lot of effort to come to this. And I also agree with you, Heather, that it's almost surprising that they're continually renewed. But I think that the fact that they just linked it to the Minsk agreements was a smart thing to do, because then, they could say, okay, it hasn't been reached, so we have to prolong it again. But there are, even here in Belgium, there's certain regions who suffer from these sanctions and who put up plaques along the street, abandon the sanctions against Russia, because also within Europe it's being felt. But it's being prolonged, and the fact that this effort was taken is it also shows, and I think this is also something that we've seen from Josep Borrell, that there is quite some pessimism from the EU towards Russia in this relation. And for me, I feel that since 2014, this pessimism has only increased, and I don't really see any way how we can improve it. I don't want to be too pessimistic myself, but yeah.
Thank you. I would like to point out two types of numbers related to business. First, it's the fact that trade flows have been influenced by the crisis in 2014-15, obviously. So we first saw a clear dip in the trade flows between the EU and Russia, about 25% down. But now gradually coming back to the level it was before. Even soft, there are still the sanctions, and politically, obviously, the atmosphere is not more friendly. So how do you explain the fact that we still see a lot of trade flows, even soft, the political atmosphere is not good? And the other number that is interesting as we speak of the transatlantic relationship is the fact that actually the EU is trading with Russia about 10 times more than the United States. So how does it make it difficult for the EU and Americans to agree on a Russia policy, because economic interests are obviously different, they are of a different order? So maybe first to you, Heather.
Mr. Ambassador, you're absolutely right. And this is where sanctioning, I won't say it's easy for the US, but we do not have the economic relationship that will be harmed. And certainly Europe has a much more powerful relationship. This is why, for the US to sanction Russia alone really has minimal effect. This is why it's so essential that we join with the EU. Then it will have a more powerful effect. We too were very surprised. We have held a series of reports we call the Kremlin Playbook, which looks at Russia's economic presence and influence in a select number of European countries. We look at a case-by-case basis. And in our second report, we actually looked at sort of the last decade, even before Crimea to almost the present. And we had assumed we would see a bigger dip because of sanctions. But again, in the individual countries that we looked at, particularly the Netherlands, Austria, Italy, those that have strong economic ties to Russia, both foreign direct investment flows in Russia, as well as energy ties and banking ties, actually we were seeing that those economic ties grew after 2014. This is in part due to structuring. So for example, the Netherlands has a very powerful incorporation. They're very similar to our Delaware, our state of Delaware, meaning Russians use the Netherlands very strongly for opening up subsidiaries. They aren't Dutch firms, but they take on the character for tax purposes and then can move throughout the EU. So we were seeing where forces really enabled increased Russian economic ties, regardless of sanctions, behavior. And that's where we found the real durability of those relationships. They were at the highest political levels. They were at the most important state companies, particularly energy companies, banks. And I think this was actually discovered just very recently as the EU was trying to impose very punishing sanctions on Belarus. They discovered that Austria is really the main banking source for Belarus. And so this is where these ties, and it becomes very difficult to sanction. So I think that's a real point that, again, if we are to uphold international norms, whether it's territorial integrity, the Chemical Weapons Convention, arms control violations, you name it, it takes a decision that we actually harm ourselves economically for a greater purpose. But if we aren't interested in upholding those rules, we don't need to sanction or punish. And that's where we get into this very difficult conversation where I think was saying, the EU is a normative framework. It upholds these values, but at the same time, that will cost it economically. And there's a lot of pushback on companies and political figures that gain enormous financial benefit from these ties and these relations. So that's the very difficult Gordian knot to tie. I will say, just again, very briefly, I think one underappreciated element of the Biden administration's policy approach is anti-corruption. And this is something that the White House has just released, a national security study memorandum, a big presidential study. The U.S. has already sanctioned Bulgarian and Albanian, we're talking former prime ministers, former interior ministers, to capture this corruption. And I think you're going to continue to see that used in the Russian context. And of course, some of that Russian corruption runs squarely through Europe. It also runs through the US. I'm not pointing a finger, but that's going to be something that I think this administration is going to focus on a great deal. And it may make some of our EU colleagues feel very uncomfortable when we do it.
Lynn, any comment about this economic dimension, trade flows, investment?
Yeah, well, I actually I have not so much to add because I agree with what Heather says, but I think it mainly comes down to, for the EU side, the gap or the difference between discourse and actions, of course. And it's what at a certain moment, let's say in the reaction, the first reaction, when after the annexation of Crimea, and I think it was, or was it Mogherini who coined this term? We consider our relations with with Russia as not business as usual. But this was repeated over and over again. We freeze some of the relations, there are sanctions, and we consider our relations, our strategic partnership has stopped. Now it's not business as usual, but actually it was business as usual bilaterally between a lot of countries and Russia. And maybe to also add to this, you mentioned the Netherlands. It's interesting for me from the university perspective to see how, for example, of course, all the countries abide with prolonging the sanctions, but a lot of countries also engage to improve the relationship with Russia. So, for example, the Netherlands has, I think 2 years ago, they launched a huge call for cultural diplomacy projects with Russia. And everyone I know who applied on it, and it went from common cultural heritage to all kinds of projects on history, but also law, and so all academic disciplines. Everybody who just stressed the importance of this vector, the Netherlands, Russia, was sponsored for organizing a conference or having a project. So you see countries bilaterally not only engaging economically, but also engaging academically. There's lots of course, still students exchange, common research. So it is, to a certain extent, business as usual. And I think, of course, on the high politics level, officially we're not on speaking terms, but at the same time, a lot simply continues because it's also difficult to disentangle. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Since we still have no questions from the audience, let me go on with another question. And I think a bit as a follow-up to what we just discussed is how to reach out to the wider Russian public beyond the Kremlin, because everybody agrees, both in Washington and Brussels, that we need to keep and even promote people-to-people contact with the Russians. It seems to be increasingly difficult because there is an obvious Kremlin policy to try to prevent these contacts by designing Russian associations as foreign agents, etc. So how do you see it, both from your American and European perspective? How can we favor people-to-people contact? Heather.
Well, I'm so glad you raised this question because this is really what's been missing in all of our policies and in our strategies. How can we communicate to the Russian people? And Ambassador, you absolutely hit it. This is exactly why Russia has been working very hard to make touching a Western organization difficult, because that's the last thing that they want. So if you work with a Western organization, you are a foreign agent, you are undesirable. In the case of Alexei Navalny, now you're an extremist. You're the equivalent to ISIS. So it is really to make sure, again, that is that self-isolating posture to make sure that Western messages don't get inside of Russia. You see, the Russian internet used to be very open, very free. Now that is being squeezed and slowed, particularly because the Anti-Corruption Foundation uses very effective social media mobilization for its protests, for its smart voting approaches, so they're slowing that down. And of course, investigative journalists of any kind have left, or they're just trying to survive. So it's really, and of course, they're also trying to push Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe out of Moscow right now. It's a major issue. So the last vestige of what the US can continue to hopefully support a different version of news that the Russian people typically get from state-controlled outlets, even that's being pushed out. But I think we do have an opportunity in some ways because investigative journalists have left. They're in Ukraine, maybe they're in the Baltic states, in Central Europe. Belarusian bloggers and media we know have shifted east. So let's work with them. Let's give them tools. This has to be Russia's story, and they have to tell it. And they need to have the tools to be able to do this. It can't be a US or a European effort to tell that story, but we can give the investigative journalists, bloggers, the opportunity to speak. I think the other thing we should think about in our public speaking, this is not about democracy, it is about dignity of the individual. How the Russian people can choose their form of governments and who their government and who they wish to be in the Duma or the president of their country, that is their choice. But unfortunately, the regime now has decided there can be no choice. There can be no choice. And while, as I said, we respect choice, we respect choice for the Ukrainian people to choose their alliances and their orientation. We encourage the Russian people to have free choice whatever they choose. And I think that's the message we need to continue to speak out. That is who we are. I think President Biden did a very good job of that at the Geneva Summit. That's who we are. Those are our values. And we're going to continue to speak out about them. But we have to give tools to allow the Russian journalists to help tell the Russian people another story.
Lee?
Yes, thank you. I agree, Heather. And I think when it comes to communication, informing the wider audience, I think here the EU can really learn from the US, because this is something that, from my experience, when I followed, for example, the whole Ukrainian crisis in 2014, it was of course nobody ever expected Russia, or at least I didn't. I will not speak for everyone, but to Russia to invade Crimea. But what I noticed immediately when the protests even on Maidan started was that the EU really had difficulty to reach the Ukrainian audience, but also the Russian public. And so there was such a difference in the approach of the EU on the one hand and Russia on the other, and the US on the other hand, because EU was, and up until recently, was only trying to debunk information and trying to say, no, this is not correct, this is disinformation. And I remember very well on social media, on Twitter, for example, you could see that the American embassy in Kiev immediately started a Russian language Twitter account to inform the Ukrainian citizens in Russian and in Ukrainian, of course, what was going on, to give another voice, let's say. And so for the EU, this was I think, a very steep learning curve that now I think, because the East Stratcom, the task force that was sponsored by the European Commission, they started a whole EU versus disinformation website. But still, for a very long time, it was focused on debunking fake news, debunking disinformation. And I think only recently, also the EU has started a very active public diplomacy by making some YouTube channels in Russian, informing people about EU policies and decisions and their view on the sanctions and the necessity. But it's something that was completely absent 7 years ago. And I think actually not only the EU can learn, but probably has learned already from the US. It was such a difference in this strategy of reaching the wider audience.
Thank you. I now received a few questions from the audience. The first one is for you, Heather. How do you understand the sharing of the list of 16 critical infrastructure by President Biden in terms of cybersecurity that should be out of reach for any aggressive behavior? Is that also a gamble?
Well, it is, because I mean, on the one hand, let me be very clear. I think it's important to be very clear what we consider is off limits, and it's that, understand the last several months, these ransomware attacks have shut down pipelines. The solar winds, that was an espionage effort, but that was crippling as well. We have just had a series of cyber attacks emanating from either Russian state sources or criminal groups based on the territory of Russia, which have really caused some destructive effects. And this was an effort to, in the language of the White House, to put guardrails around this, to say, look, enough. We've already sanctioned Russia on the SolarWinds hack, but this was this list of 16 issues that don't go there. And if you do go there, we're going to, have a very powerful effect. And it sounded like offensive cyber capabilities, which we have used in the past, but very limited. So the gamble is when Russia tests those red lines, is the US fully prepared to take the actions that it said? I mean, deterrence is only as good as both the political will that is behind it, whether the adversary believes that there will be significant punishment, therefore it's not in its best interest to go forward with that, or is it willing to see and test those bounds? Now, I would argue, at least again, what we understand in open sources, for instance, hospitals were placed on that list, but we've already, the US government has already informed that during the pandemic, there was cyber attacks on US hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. So in some ways that red line had already been crossed. So let's hope the conversations, the private ones that we're not privy to, was very clear. but we won't know until those red lines are tested. What I fear is, and which is why I mentioned the Polish case, that perhaps they, for temporarily will not test the U.S. anymore because of deterrence, but perhaps they're going to test our allies very clearly and probe their cyber security and their cyber capabilities. Now that NATO has made cyber, an area, a domain that is now available for Article 5, what happens if Russia probes an ally? Will the U.S. red lines be enforced, or, well, that wasn't us? That they're going to probe those scenes, and particularly the use of criminal organizations. I actually think it'll be interesting if we see a real downgrading of ransomware criminal group attacks. Does that suggest that the Russian state does control them? And because this was a clear admonishment, in order to get a stable and predictable relationship, does that suggest that Russia controls that effect? If they did, then that speaks to what just happened to the United States for the last several weeks. If we continue to see those criminal groups use ransomware attacks, will those red lines be crossed? So it is going to be a very dynamic situation. I have to say, I'm not optimistic that the creation of a cyber task force or working group, successive U.S. administrations, the Obama administration in 2013, the Trump administration in 2017, I believe, tried to create these like cyber expert working groups. And quite frankly, we just don't even agree on the principles to be able to create, some positive dialogue. So here's hope over experience, but this is very serious. And let's hope red lines aren't tested. And if they are, from a U.S. perspective, I hope the U.S. government is fully prepared to have its actions meet its rhetoric. Because if we're going to do a Syria red lines, tough rhetoric, but we are not fully prepared to take the action, that actually weakens us. It weakens our allies' resolve in that space as well.
And maybe a short follow-up question. Do you see a potential for EU-US cooperation in that field? Heather?
In the cyber activities, and this gets to your, I think a second question you had mentioned about resilience. We need to do a much better job of being more resilient to cyber attacks. Quite frankly, I'd rather deter them than be resilient, because resilience suggests we've been attacked and we are, trying to make sure we can bounce back very quickly, which is of course very important. But let's deter them from happening at the beginning. Again, we can't hide anymore. Our ability to make attribution is much better and much faster in both the public sector and the private sector. The problem is that you need political will to then attribute and take actions if you deem those necessary. And what's happened is we're now attributing Russian malign activities. The Czech Republic just went back, as Bulgaria did, to 2014. The Germans recently were acknowledging activities in 2015. We can't wait that long. There has to be much quicker response, and as I said, strong response, because we want to deter them from continuing to probe this space. And I think, quite frankly, they have been able to probe through a variety of weaknesses in the US system, in the European system as well, that we have to do a much better job. Every citizen has to understand that they have a role to play as a whole of society in making sure that they are not victims, and that they are using great cyber hygiene so we can prevent these types of attacks. Unfortunately, this is the nature of where we are technologically, but we really have to be much more not only resilient, but stronger in deterring these types of phishing ransomware attacks from happening.
Thank you. And now move to another question from the audience. For you, Lynn, it's somewhat of a technical and legal nature, but might be interesting. I don't know if you know the answer. It's about the human rights sanctions by the EU. Actually, are they adopted by the EU under its own human rights sanctions regime, or are they somewhat related to Article 2 of the EU-Russia Cooperation Agreement, which also refers to human rights? Do you know the answer to this question?
No.
No.
No, I don't. I'm to be honest, no. I think I think actually the first, but I wouldn't be 100% sure. So no, I can't answer this question. It's
So
I
it's an
wouldn't
interesting
want to
field,
lie.
for us also to inquire about, because it's not legal, it's also political, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, for sure.
I move on to a third question from the audience. So if we see that Russia is creating a greater distance between itself and the EU and the US on the other side, to the West generally, but it is having a relationship of convenience with China. Even so, Russia clearly also have a lot of differences in interest, strategy, size between Russia and China. So why is this working between Russia and China, and could we not lure Russia into doing the same with the West? So I would first propose my own answer with my experience in Moscow. I would say simply because the Russian people are not attracted by the Chinese model for their own society. They are attracted by the Western model, and that's why the Russian government feels a need to depict the Western model as being negative, because it is so attractive for Russian people. And so that's what I would propose as an answer. But Heather and Lynn, you might have a different view.
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it gets back to some of Lean's great elements of her presentation, talking about the civilizational nationalism. I mean, we know from our Russian history, neither East nor West, this concept of Russia as a unique civilization. But I agree with you, it sees itself as a European power. That is where it sees itself. The problem is the Putin regime, its survival is based on continuous confrontation with the West. That is what he's protecting Russia from, the West and the decadence of the West, either the social agenda or NATO. So if you are in a constant struggle with the West, you can't, join that side. So you turn east, and of course, Western sanctions help facilitate and propel Russia, which was very late. Europe and the United States and economies pivoted to China and the Asian markets long ago. Russia was very delayed in that pivot. They're quickly trying to reorient energy markets through the Arctic, Yamal LNG, Power of Siberia, pipelines. They're trying to reorient that. But as I said, it is an uncomfortable partnership, but I think we've evolved from the marriage of convenience. This is now a growing partnership. The partnership has expressions in the military dimension, in the economic dimension. I mentioned the Polar Silk Road, Arctic, but as well as other Chinese investments. It has a scientific expression, and it has a diplomatic expression, particularly at the UN Security Council, where there's sort of a pseudo anti-Western condominium between Beijing and Moscow. But this is a very uncomfortable relationship for Moscow. But I think it is beginning to accept that it must do this, and hoping for maybe something different happening. Maybe it will regain its economic strength. Maybe it will regain its strength to be able to not have to rely increasingly on China. And China will be very selective in what it needs from Russia. It doesn't need Russia economically. It would like some elements, shipping, energy, agricultural commodities, that type of thing. So this is going to be a very uncomfortable partnership. I don't believe the U.S. can create the wedge or frictions between the two. We can continue to remind the Russian strategic community that it has more to gain for its own independence and autonomy from balancing between the two than siding with just China. But that is a decision that the regime will make. But I agree with the ambassador. The Russian people are highly uncomfortable with a growing Chinese economic relationship, certainly a greater Chinese presence within Russia. But as I said, I think the regime, for its own survival purposes, has made some decisions that it must lean towards Beijing more. And I don't think we're going to be able to dissuade it, unfortunately.
Thank you. Lynn, on the same question?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Heather says, but I think indeed we shouldn't underestimate Europe being a touchstone for Russia culturally, and even if the government doesn't agree anymore and opts to self-isolate, let's say, or isolate itself from the West, the attraction in Russia or among the Russian audience of Europe is high. So this is why, of course, it's being discredited. There's a colleague of mine in London, Jeffrey Hosking. He's a famous historian of Russia, and he wrote this wonderful book, Russia, People and Empire. He wrote another book called Russia and the Russians, and he stated that if you look at Russia's long history, and of course also the development of Russia, originating in, of course, Kiev, Rus, but then expanding all towards Asia. He stated, and I now repeat it a bit simplistically, but he stated it in a very well argumented way, that when it comes to governance for Russia, the touchstone very often is Asia, but when it comes to culture and to living and to looking how one wants to develop a country, one looks to Europe, of course, and this is something we cannot take away. So in this, of course, it pivots. Look at 2014, right after the crisis, the big gas deal was signed with China, at a high cost for Russia. But it is a point of attraction for Russia that is not as good as Europe is, even I think in this situation, in the current situation.
Thank you. I have a final question from the audience about strategic stability. And one of the result of the recent summit in Geneva is that there is an agreement to speak about strategic stability for the future, arms control. And so what is your assessment, both of you, about the likely result of these talks, because they are obviously of interest not just to the US and Russia, but also of great interest to Europeans. So Heather, well, how do you see these strategic talks?
Yeah, I think we have to have some fairly modest expectations here. Clearly, it was very positive that President Putin and President Biden extended the New START treaty by 5 years. I mean, New START is the only thing we have left in the arms control architecture that is still functioning. But from a Washington perspective, there is just so little trust about Russia and arms control because of their repeated violations of existing treaties. I mean, I will tell you, there's a difference. It seems Russia enters arms control treaties and then violates them while they're still under the treaty. The United States meets the obligations of the treaty, but when we want to violate them, we withdraw ourselves from that violation. I mean, it's a very different approach. We do need to have a holistic conversation with Russia on basically what I call arms control scaffolding for the 21st century. There are so many classes of weapons, particularly the new weapons that Russia has been developing, that aren't even under any treaty. They're not under the New START treaty. They are anti-satellite weapons, so it's space-based. They are the new exotics, these hypersonics, even these underwater nuclear drones that we believe Russia is developing. So in addition, we don't have any treaty requirements for intermediate nuclear weapons, which is a great concern, obviously, to European security. So we've done a lot of track 2 discussions with Russian colleagues. We have to basically start very slowly with some building blocks to rebuild trust. And they have to have pretty intrusive verification or they're not going to go forward. And thus far, the Russians certainly don't encourage or don't support intrusive verification. But hopefully we can get some principles in place. I think we are very far away from legally binding treaties. Quite frankly, just the reflection of the U.S. politics in the Senate, I don't believe we could get an arms control treaty ratified through our Senate. So let's just start building a little confidence, some trust. Let's get some verification back into this, and let's hope we can then be in a better place. If not, I just do not foresee a very promising arms control negotiation. I think the two sides just have, are just too far apart, and the issues now are intertwined with nuclear, non-nuclear, tactical, strategic. Cyber is a huge issue that crosses all of those. So it's a very complex undertaking. So modest expectations, first steps. Let's slowly rebuild trust again, because there is none between the parties.
Thank you. Lynn, please.
Yes, I really liked, I read an analysis a couple of days ago by a member of the Council of European Council on Foreign Relations, who assessed, I think it was Kadri, I'm not sure, but who assessed the Biden-Putin summit and called it the return of diplomacy, and said this is this type of summit and this type of talks, it shows that it's actually unveils the power of old-fashioned diplomacy and working patiently away at very difficult problems. And I think that I found it a rather good, rather optimistic reading, but let's end the conversation on an optimistic note. But at the same time, it's what Heather said, it all comes down to trust. And building trust, and as you say, I agree completely, slowly building trust, but of course, where do we come from? If we look, I remember a colleague of mine quoting then European Council President, I think, no, it was not, was it Tusk or was it Van Rompuy, who had a conversation with Angela Merkel in full Ukraine crisis, and who said that she called him an absolutely untrustworthy person. During this whole crisis and during the annexation, she said, every telephone conversation I had with him was full of lies. So why, this is the most untrustworthy person we can work with. So coming from this, this building trust, of course, is very crucial. But I think there, of course, that this is the role of diplomacy and slow diplomacy, and compartmentalizing different topics and working on this. This is, I think, the only thing we can do, not trying not to end too pessimistically, let's say.
Thank you. So I have to thank you, both of you, first of all, because you made the show today. Thanks a lot for your insight into this very important topic, so all of us. I also thank the audience for bearing with all of us and this important issues. I would conclude by saying that indeed there is certainly an increased scope for dialogue between Europeans and Americans, and actually also for actions, as was also evidenced by the recent sanctions decided by the EU on Belarus as a result of the hijacking a few weeks ago. And these sanctions were adopted also by the United States with a very similar wording. And so it seems that indeed we are not just talking to each other, but we are also taking actions together, which is important also when we look forward to the future. And let me end also by saying that this series of lectures of the spring of 2001 by the Transatlantic lecture series is available on internet to be rewatched by the audience. And you can see all the references on the website from the Catholic University of Leuven. So thanks to all of you. Thanks in particular to you two ladies. Heather, I'll be happy to see you in Washington again. And Lynn, I hope to see you in a few months when I will visit Brussels. So have a good day, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.